All right. Welcome, everyone, both in person and who's joining the recording for our Level Up Live. This week's all about goal setting. And I think there'll be some crossover points to the session that Ethan ran a few weeks ago, that sort of snowball effect idea. I think there's going to be a lot of interesting things that you'll recognize if you listen to that. But I guess mine, I'm speaking a little bit more from a neuroscience perspective, a little more about how our neurochemistry and our decisions actually affect our neurochemistry, and how that then has a snowball effect, as Ethan was talking about. So you get a little bit more of an idea around the idea of goal setting. It's something that I think if really anyone that joins a gym like Fifth Element will have done some form of goal setting in their life, whether they're doing it consciously or unconsciously. There's always a reason that we're going to invest that amount of time, energy into doing something for ourselves. And something that I've learned, I guess, along the way, both through yoga, through my own training, but also then through studying psychology, is how important it is to do goal setting well and to set ourselves up for success. It's something that I think Fifth does incredibly well, which is, and Sam talks about it all the time, of starting with small, manageable goals so that we are beginning to gain a sense of momentum, which makes us more likely to succeed in the future. And I'm going to give you a little bit of insight as to how that works through a neurochemical perspective. And I'm going to do my best. I'm basically I'm sort of condensing a workshop I normally run that goes about 2 hours into 25 minutes. So bear with me as I go through this relatively quickly, but it's basically set around four main ideas. And I guess that will leave you with sort of four simple takeaways. The first one being, when it comes to goal setting, the most important thing I can think of is to be realistic. We all know, and we've probably all been there, someone or ourselves, that, the easiest example I can think of is a New Year's resolution, where maybe you woke up a bit hungover and then you decide you're going to not drink for the whole of January, or woken up at 5 a.m. once for the last 365 days, and yet you think you're going to wake up at 5 a.m. every single morning from that point on. And that sort of idea, these relatively extreme things of going from 0 to 100. And actually that has the potential for a really adverse effect on our ability to meet those goals, but also our ability to meet goals we set for ourselves in the future. And so the targets we set for ourselves, and when we set them for, really, really matter. And an important thing to note at this point is that setting goals feels really good for our body and for our brains. So every time we set a goal, we actually get a little bit of a dopamine hit. So the same hit that we get when we eat junk food, when we do something, when we do something that's like a pleasurable activity, we get the same feeling when we set a goal. And I think we all kind of know that when you sit down and you write a to-do list, we kind of go, oh, it's nice to get this stuff out of my brain. But actually on a neurochemical level, we're getting a dopamine hit. And so the idea of setting goals is that dopamine is a motivating chemical. It's not actually a reward chemical. It kind of gets misunderstood a little bit as a reward chemical. It's actually a motivating chemical. It's what gets us to begin to think of moving ourselves from A to B. Cortisol is what gives us, I guess, the energy to do that. Sam will speak about that a fair bit, that when we wake up, we get a bit of a burst of cortisol and we try and ride that throughout our day. And we want to keep that at a healthy level. But dopamine is actually what mentally gives us that sort of motivation. And what's also important to note is that meeting those targets does feel good, but it doesn't feel as good on a neurochemical level as setting them. And I think that's a really, really important point to make at this, point to make at this part of the discussion, is that when we hit a target, it doesn't feel as good as setting that target in the first place. And actually, what our mind does when we do hit a target, and you might know, an easy example is, say you're trying to hit 60 kilos in the deadlift. You do it and you feel good. What's the next thing you do? You go, okay, next time I hit 65. And immediately your mind begins to move the goalposts, and it begins to shift in a progression of another further goal. Again, it gives us a little bit, bit of that dopamine effect. The potential negative of that is that as we begin to set goals that are out of our reach at that moment of time, every time we fail to hit a goal that we're aiming for, we actually begin to restrict our serotonin release and increase our cortisol. And so the easiest way to sum up that scientific sort of explanation is, Every time we hit a goal and we don't see ourselves as hitting it, we are more likely to fail in the future. I use fail as in inverted commas. But every time we set a goal that we don't hit, we are less likely to hit goals in the future. And because on a neurochemical level, our body goes, okay, I wanted this to happen. It didn't. I'm going to put more energy into preparing myself for stress, difficulty, cortisol, and I'm going to reduce the amount of serotonin and dopamine that I release, happiness and reward chemicals. And so it's a really interesting thing to say that goal setting has a very important role to play on our levels of happiness. And not only when we don't hit them are we going to feel worse, but we are less likely to then be able to hit them in the future. And so what do we do about that? Easiest thing is to set small, manageable targets. Every time we set a small and manageable target that we meet, we then become more likely to meet the next one in the future. Our body reduces cortisol, increases serotonin. And so we become more motivated, more excited, more happy, more pleased with ourselves, essentially, and we become more likely to hit these things in the future. And so if you have say you're trying to gain 2 kilos of muscle in the space of 2 weeks, pretty unlikely. You don't do that, you see yourself as a failure, you're less likely to go to the gym. It's really as simple as that. We don't feel as motivated, we don't feel as excited, and we actually have more inhibitors that are going to stop us doing it. And so if you say instead, I want to gain 2 kilos in 2.5 months, and you do that, then you set the next one, you're much more likely to move that in the future. And so basically, the more we see ourselves as successful, the more successful we're going to be with the next few things that we do. And so my tip for when it's about being realistic is to start small and build. Start with really small increases, watch the momentum begin to grow and increase, that snowball effect from a positive way, and you're more likely to get that momentum as you move forward. So the second one is to actually be very specific. It's very easy to say, as an example, I want to feel fitter. That's quite hard to equate if you don't have some form of measurement or some sort of ideal that means that you feel like you met that goal. For some people, it could be, I ran 2 kilometers without feeling puffed. For someone, it could be I lifted 10 kilos. It could be whatever the metric we're using in this singular example. It needs to be something that you recognize that you've been able to hit, because then again, you get that reward of being seen as successful. You get that sense that you have achieved something. When I work a lot one-on-one with people, one thing they often say is, I want to feel less stressed. And my first question is, great, what does that look like? Because just feeling less stressed is too ambiguous to notice that you've arrived there. So maybe it's, I sleep consistently without waking up. Maybe it's when I wake up in the morning, my brain isn't just totally full of work things. Whatever the metric we begin to determine it as, is a very important thing to do, because then you can recognize that, then you're able to recognize that you've met that goal and that you've moved in that direction. The other thing in terms of the specificity is you also want something to stretch you a little bit. You want something that you have to work in order to achieve. So to use an easy gym example again, say you're bench pressing 25 kilos and you say in the next month you want to bench press 27.5. That's probably not enough to get that sort of neurochemical interaction that we're looking for. So you want to find, and whether it's working with the trainer or working with one of the health coaches at the gym, in this specific example, you want to find something that is going to require the effort and intensity and achievement that you need to feel like you've done something, and yet not something that isn't too far out of reach. And something else that's really useful is to actually visualize what success looks like. There's a lot of people that will talk about this, I guess, from a business perspective, is like actually knowing where you're going. And so for some people, it could be having enough mobility to do a squat without pain. I'm only using gym examples because it's going to be easier in terms of the condensed format of this. It could be, being able to get in out of bed without pain. It could be running 2 kilometers in a certain time, whatever it might be. Having a really specific goal that you're moving towards and being able to visualize what that looks like, what that feels like, again, makes us more likely to be able to achieve it. The idea is that with doing this, and not setting the bar too low and too high, is we're actually refining our level of focus as well. I talk about this quite a lot, that life is very busy and we have so many options and so many different things to choose from and focus on, that when we're thinking about goals, we need them to be specific and clear, and realistic, in order to actually narrow our focus and avoid distraction. And so, for example, if you have this health goal of being able to run 2Ks at a certain amount of time, and you've set yourself that you want to do it by this date, maybe the night before, and you end up not having those 2 glasses of wine or not having that certain meal because it makes you more likely to hit it. We're refining the kind of incredible amount of choice we have in our life down to this element and down to this capacity to say, okay, this is the thing I'm going to try and achieve, and this is what I'm working myself towards. And so my tip around being specific is to go narrow and go deep. This idea that you are looking at a very specific thing and you're working yourself towards that, and almost having a more singular focus towards it, opposed to something that's a little more fluffy, like I want to be more fit, I want to be less stressed. As an add-on to that, my next thing would be to make sure that you're really clear, and to have this sort of see how a goal actually fits in with a bigger vision of your life. So if your bigger vision that isn't necessarily very easy to equate or to measure is, I want to be healthier. Okay, what are the smaller goals that move you in direction of that bigger one? Because being healthier is actually an endless journey. You can always essentially be healthier. And so I often use this example a little bit with people that is going to fall on deaf ears to some, and it will make a lot of sense to a lot of other people. It's kind of one of the reasons I think in Harry Potter that the game of Quidditch is one that is actually such an amazing ideal. Because for those of you that either have or haven't watched it, there's the game where they play with the quaffle, where they're trying to score back and forth. And there's also the seeker who's looking for the snitch. And the interesting thing with this game is that the snitch is what ends the game and gets you 150 points, whereas the smaller goals only get you 10 points. And so I think of our smaller goals of, okay, I want to hit this on the bench press, run this many kilometers, I want to meditate 5 minutes every day, whatever. They're the quaffle games going on. And the almost unattainable one that's kind of going on in the background is the game of the snitch. And so it's the higher ideal that our life is moving towards. So that could be being healthier, because it's elusive. It's very hard to find. It's very hard to make sure that you actually grasp. But what's the smaller game that we can play whilst the bigger game is going on? And generally, you might then notice that after 1 to 5 years of this sort of investment in ourselves, that you do feel healthier. And maybe the game, you've all noticed you've actually caught the snitch, but the rest of the game had to be going on in order for that to happen. That analogy will make a lot of sense to Harry Potter fans, probably not a huge amount to people that have never seen the movies. But it's basically this idea that having a vision of our life and having the smaller goals that support that vision is going to make us much more likely. It's going to make us much more likely to continue progress and to continue engage. And that kind of give us a little bit more of a deeper meaning. For anyone that has heard Matt tell the story, when he was at Fitness First, he used to tell, I remember when I first signed up at the gym 5 or 6 years ago, he said, at Fitness First, what they noticed by far the most dedicated gym goers were women in preparation for their wedding. They were the ones that were more likely to go to every PT session, to turn up at the gym as regular as they promised and all that sort of thing. And then almost to the date that their wedding would be, they would stop coming, because they had something that they were aiming for. So that's the smaller goals. And yet that doesn't necessarily serve the higher ideal of being healthier, because there's a very specific timeline in place. And so it's very useful from the smaller goal setting perspective. But we want to have a bigger vision of our life that these smaller goals align with. They're going to continually keep us motivated and continually keep us engaged. And yeah, that point is probably where this sort of bigger workshop that I tend to run, we really go a little bit deeper onto that idea that we want small goals to support a bigger vision. And in this small amount of time, I'm not gonna have the time to necessarily go into that. But having a little bit of a think around, okay, what do I want my life to look like in 5, 6, 7 years? How do I want to be in that? And what small goals can I begin to create and make, whether it's in my health journey or other parts of my life, they're going to support that vision. The last one that may be kind of a little bit out of left field for some, but is actually really interesting, is to be grateful. And science is kind of only really beginning to understand the effect that gratitude actually has on our neurochemistry and on our nervous system. And we as human beings used to have something that we had elements that were so naturally embedded into our day-to-day life, things like rituals like prayer, or going to some sort of whether it was some sort of religious ceremony or some sort of community ceremony, something, or some sort of seasonal ceremony, something that used to basically allow us to recognize the fact that we are alive and that we are in a sense of community, and that we actually have this sense of almost wonder and awe that exists in our life. Now, a couple of things that I've noticed and engaged with through, I guess I found them first through my more Eastern understanding, and it's actually come into my Western studies of psychology, has been that people that cultivate gratitude on a regular basis will be markedly less stressed, markedly less likely to die of stress-related diseases, and more likely to feel a sense of engagement in their day-to-day lives. And there are different metrics for how they've measured those things. It's not just they're like, yeah, seems to be. It's like, no, these are actual metrics that they've been able to measure. This idea that as we positively reframe the changes that we're trying to make, and that we are lucky to be in a position to be making those things, that we have the freedom to be able to make these sort of choices in our life and move our life in a more positive direction, we are more likely to then hit those goals. And so seeing one of the understandings, or one of the things that I've learned, I guess, through this, is that when we practice gratitude regularly, and when I say practice gratitude, there actually has to be a very felt experience of it. About 4 years ago, when there's a lot of stuff on social media and in the spaces that I work in that like being grateful is important. So I'd wake up every day and I'd write down 3 things I'm grateful for. And I realized it was just, for me, a very useless thing, because I was completely unengaged with what I was doing. I was kind of just like, oh, I'm grateful for like the sun, the sky, and, my family. But I wasn't actually feeling into what it meant. And so I wasn't getting anything, any sort of neurological rewards from it, because I was kind of doing it as a rote thing opposed to something that I actually experienced. And so gratitude, when practiced properly, releases serotonin, oxytocin, and endorphins. Oxytocin is oxytocin is the kind of connection chemical that we feel. It's why we feel good when we connect with other people. It's why we feel good when we hug other people. Also, the kind of connection that we get through ourselves in our life. It's not just a human interaction. It's like when we feel connected to ourselves, to something else, that's when we get a release of oxytocin. It actually has a valve that releases oxytocin directly into our hearts. And so when people talk about connection being good for our hearts, there's actually a very real neurological impact that does have. I can't remember the specific name of it, but if you typed in, if you typed in oxytocin and the heart TED talk, there is a really wonderful TED talk from a neurological scientist that talks about this. And one of the things that is explained is that when we don't feel like we're present in our lives, when we don't feel grateful for what is in our lives, we spend much more time essentially focusing on what isn't there. Every time we're focusing on what we don't have, we are essentially not present. And so one of the reasons I always harp on about things like meditation, and in some cases yoga, and practices that have the ability to cultivate presence, is that it allows us to drop into a sense of what we have here and now. Thanks, Vince. I think you probably just found it. It allows us to drop into the sense of what we have here and now. It allows us to be grateful for that. And it actually has a very great and important impact on our health. We shift from this level of expectation to appreciation. This sense of, well, why don't I have these things, opposed to what are the things that I do have. And what I've got written here is that gratitude is the practice of realizing what we are grateful for, having a physical experience of it, which subsequently drops us into presence. This ability to recognize what we have every day, here and now, and not focus solely on the things that we don't have. In doing this, we are actually settling our nervous system. We are encouraging the healthier, happier, more positive hormones in our body to supply us more regularly and more readily. And in doing that, it means that we're not trying to achieve our goals from a sense of lack. And I think that's kind of the final thing that I want to leave you with. It's not this sense of, it's not trying to achieve something because I'm not good enough. It's trying to achieve something because I get to. I don't have to do this thing because I'm not good enough, because I'm not strong enough, or because I'm too heavy, or whatever it might be. It's, I have a body and I get to explore what this might look like. And I get to do this. And this is how I personally see my exercise. And it's taken me a bit of time to get to this point. And I'm not going to say there isn't elements of, I can't say for sure anyway, that there aren't elements of, like, at times insecurity or other things that motivate me to exercise, but it definitely used to be far more prevalent in my life, of like feeling like I was too skinny or not fit enough or whatever it is. And now I see every time I get to every time I exercise, as I get to do this, as I'm an able-bodied, able-minded human, and it's a gift to have a body and to feel how amazing it is to go for a run, to go to the gym, to, do yoga, to stretch, whatever it might be, and to see it as a gift that I get to do that, opposed to a chore that I have to do. And for me, that journey has come through gratitude. And so those are the four things, I guess. The idea of being realistic, being specific, being clear, and being grateful. And when it comes to our goal setting, to set ourselves up for that level of success through that approach, sets us up for those mental, physical, and hormonal benefits, and sets us up through those elements for the greatest likelihood of success. And so, yeah, like I said, that's a bigger thing to talk about, but hopefully there's a few nuggets that might be useful for you guys. I always leave a bit of time for any questions from those of you alive, if you would like me to answer any here. Always, the people that are online, feel free to message me or to reach out, and I'm happy to have a further chat. But for you guys that are here now, any questions or any thoughts on the back of that?
Ziggy, that was really good. I'd love to hear, your longer version of this topic, but I never expected to hear someone talking about goal setting and to mention being grateful. I think that's really quite insightful, and love the Harry Potter metaphor, by the way, as a
Yeah,
Harry Potter fan.
good.
But it's interesting because last year, 2023, I set a pretty big goal in terms of what I wanted to do, and when I got to that point, I actually had this huge crash for a couple of weeks where I felt
Yeah.
really rotten. But this morning I did a session with Sam after I'd injured my back 8 or 9 weeks ago, and my goal was simply to get back to being able to do a trap bar deadlift. And so we did a first one, significantly lighter weight than what I was doing before hurting my back. But the buzz I got from that tiny little goal this morning, so different to having the huge 12-month goal where there was, this sense of achievement or accomplishment initially, and then within 24 hours there was this massive kind of crash and kind of disappointment, which I don't know
No,
what explains that, but I was shocked at what happened then compared to, say, this morning with a tiny little goal.
it's really interesting because, the thing that comes to mind with that is that you often hear, especially like Olympic athletes, talk about the same thing, where they've had 4 years towards the Olympics and they get this massive low after it. And it's not only the fact that they don't actually have this thing to focus on or this thing to go after anymore. It's actually like there is a chemical come down that happens from pointing so much of your life at one thing. And yeah, I think so much of the momentum element is actually being okay with that come down. I've had it in my life being a footballer and stuff, and other things that I've done. And in terms of like my sort of personal spiritual practice these days, really what it centers around is how much you can be okay when things aren't okay, how much you can actually sit in a degree of discomfort opposed to trying to move yourself out of discomfort. Because the first thing our mind will want us to do is like, oh, I don't feel that good anymore. What can I do to fix it? Opposed to being like, actually, life isn't meant to feel good 24/7. There are going to be elements of challenge and elements of pain and difficulty. And the fine line to tread between, okay, I'm sitting in this for too long and I need to begin to motivate myself to do something, or this is just a natural part of life and I have to just accept that I don't feel as great right now. But yeah, your example is a perfect one for how those neurochemicals actually work. You know, like the bigger goals, we're going to get more of a come down than the smaller ones. Anyone else before we finish up? No. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining live, guys. For those of you watching online as well, hope you got something out of it. As I said, reach out to me either via the app or okay, I should probably just put my email in the chat, so that will be there for you as well. But yeah, hope that you guys all got something useful from that, and I'll be back in probably about 3-4 weeks for the next one. So I'll hopefully speak to you then.